Hello, everyone, and welcome to Healthy at Work. My name is Catherine Wilcox, a workplace health specialist with a big passion for helping people thrive at work. From the home office to the corporate office, from the assembly line to the front line, I've got you covered here for your healthiest life at work. Now let's dive into today's show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Healthy at Work. I'm your host, Catherine, and this week I'm going to be walking you through this fourth F of nervous system response called fawning response. Many of us have heard of three other Fs: the fight, flight, and freeze responses that we may have when we are faced with threat. This fourth F, fawn response, is something that's getting a bit more attention, and we're more likely to see now in learning and training around stress management. And when we look at healing and recovering our nervous systems, we may be more likely to encounter this F. But many people, say to me, "Well, what is that? I've never heard of it. How does it show up?" And so this week on the show, I wanted to walk you through what that fourth F is, to describe it, and also to talk about how it shows up at work and what we can do if we notice that this is a response of our own nervous system in the work environment that we're navigating. So, just to start us off, I wanted to review the different responses that we can have as human beings with nervous systems when we face threats in our environment. So, something overwhelming, threatening, something that we cannot process is happening. What can we do? What can we do to survive? We can try to fight that threat, right? We can become aggressive, move towards it, try to defeat it. We can run away from it in the hopes of increasing our chances of survival, right? So, how does this show up? It can be avoidance, right? Moving away, exiting, leaving. Right? These are different ways that we might try to deal with things that are overwhelming and threatening to us in the workplace. We can also freeze, right? We can shut down. We can deactivate our nervous system. So this shows up where we don't know what to say. We don't know what to do. We might become very silent. We may become very numb inside, very unresponsive to the environment and to what's happening around us. And that is another option our nervous system has to try to keep us safe. And I really do want to emphasize that last point, that these types of responses that we see in our nervous system are geared towards safety and to keeping us safe. And sometimes I think we can really individualize and pathologize these types of responses. If we notice ourselves, for example, fighting, fleeing, freezing, shutting down, we can be really hard on ourselves. And we might even think that we're the only one, that is doing this or experiencing this type of response, or that there's something really wrong with us. And so I think it's really important, again, as we learn more about nervous system regulation, to understand that this is a protective response. So let's take a moment now to better understand some of the behaviors associated with fawning response. So, other ways fawning may be described are, people-pleasing behaviors, right? When we are really hyper-focused on the needs of others, anticipating them, merging with their needs, where we find it very difficult to take up space in meetings, in relationships, where, if somebody is engaging in inappropriate behaviors, bullying behaviors, controlling behaviors, we may actually um, befriend them, merge with them, try to stay close and connected with them as a way of establishing safety, right? Keeping our job, for example, or putting ourselves in a position where, we may be promoted even, right? It can look like apologizing to people that have hurt you. There's often a lot of self gaslighting that occurs in fawning behavior. So that means really questioning ourselves, whether we're being too sensitive or asked for, too much, and not really being able to see the inappropriate behavior of others. So really good at ignoring red flags or explaining red flags away, right? Making them white flags by, often accessing things like empathy, compassion, or rationalizing behavior, or really making somebody else's inappropriate behavior about us and maybe something that we've done or neglected to do. Um, and so, just overall, there's really this sense of, detachment from self in fawning behavior as a way of surviving. So, a minimalization of needs that we have, because there is a real sense of threat and a lack of safety in taking up space and having needs of our own. And this behavior can be rooted, as can many of our nervous system responses and activations, be rooted in early childhood development. And I can't emphasize enough, again, that this is a very protective response and makes sense, right? Especially in early childhood development and wounding, when we lack power, right? And this is very important to name. So when we lack power in relationships, the only options we may have is to try to diminish the threat in front of us by trying to control it, trying to appease it as a way of lessening the harm that comes to us, for example, by way of that threat. So, what are some examples of this? I think I gave an example of, if somebody is harming us, if we stay close to them, if we learn how to read their moods, if we learn how to adjust our behavior, right, to avoid conflict or to calm them down, that's something that can, keep us safer, especially in, childhood or caregiving situations, right, where we don't have the power and the ability just to, walk away from the people we're depending on for our survival. And the challenge with many of these behaviors is that, again, they're very adaptive at one point in our learning and our human journey. And the challenge that we often, have today with fawning behaviors, for example, is that um, we have more options, we have more choices, right? As adults with agency, but our nervous system doesn't know that, right? And I just also really want to name, just talking about things like power and how these behaviors are more likely to arise when we have relational trauma in our background, that these are also responses that are quite adaptive, in adult life as well, perhaps where we have a lack of power, systemic power. So I think about the workplace specifically, and I think about, particular groups of people that lack systemic power in our workplaces. I think about women, I think about racialized people, Indigenous people, queer and trans identified people, and how when you lack power in that system, in fact, when you may be experiencing discrimination and oppression in the workplace, in order to survive and navigate, these systems, it may be a very conditioned response. And so how else does fawning show up in the workplace? It can show up like apologizing to people who are harming you, making it about you, right? Assuming that you're being too sensitive, or that you are not a good employee, right? Because you're not working hard enough, fast enough, well enough, without questioning, right? What's happening in the system around me? When harm is happening, there can often be this sense that, it's because of something that we've done, or we haven't controlled the environment well enough. Often in fawning, we see a lot of hypervigilance. So that is when we're highly attuned to what's going on, particularly in the relationships around us. So what are other people's moods? Who's doing well? Who's in a good mood? Today, is my boss in a good mood? Are they stressed? adjust? Is there something I need to do, or adjust in my own self, in my own presentation to take up less space? And so that is one of the ways that fawning also shows up, in the workplace, where if we feel like we can minimize our needs. So when we're not speaking up, we're not letting people know we actually need that day off as well. When it's so challenging for us to bring forward our needs, um, we really minimize them and minimize conflict or attempt to in the workplace. So we kind of swallow that as a way of keeping the peace, which is really a way of trying to keep ourselves safe. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode today, this can have huge implications for things like burnout, when our needs pose a threat, to our own selves, right? When we're so disconnected and detached from ourself and what we need, that can really elevate our risk for burnout in the workplace, right? Because we're not able to monitor. We're really able to kind of cut off and shut off and not be tuned in to what our body needs, what we need emotionally. And we may also be exposed to harm that's happening, right? And rather than seeking support to address, the situations, the systems that are creating that harm, we may be more likely just to kind of swallow it, right? To go along, with it. And so huge implications, to people, in terms of human costs, and also costs to the work environment as well, right? We talk a lot in the field of workplace mental health and psychological health and safety about the role of psychological safety, right, in creating healthy work environments. And so for those that haven't heard this term, psychological safety, it's a term that's coined by Amy Edmondson, who talked about, the safety to take interpersonal risks, to speak up, right, to talk about mistakes and errors and failure, right, to say what's really on my mind. And so in some ways, when we're engaging in fawning responses in the workplace, that doesn't make psychological safety possible, right? Because we're not able to really be tuned into what we need and say what it is that we feel and contribute, right, to these environments of health where people feel like they can actually question and take up space, and there's room for disagreement, there's room for error that we know is so good for creating cultures of learning. So there's an organizational cost, to this as well. And so what is it that we can do, and what is it that workplaces can do as well, to support and better understand, what fawning is? So, if you're somebody that recognizes these behaviors in yourself, please again know that you're not alone and that these behaviors often arise in a context, right? In an interpersonal context, but also in a systemic context, which allow them to continue to thrive. So being gentle with ourselves. What are some of the things that we can start to do if, again, we notice these behaviors in ourselves, or that that's just what our nervous system tends towards if we're feeling unsafe? One of the things we can start to do is to begin to build a relationship with ourselves. And that's a process that takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. It happens through a process of beginning to attune to one's body and to be able to notice what it is that we need. It's a way of rebuilding relationship to self. In fawning, we see that people have really learned to minimize the self, to shrink, to not occupy much space, to not take up much space in relationships or at work. So the first step is, again, to rebuild that relationship. So being able to notice, and even if we can't meet our needs or voice them, beginning to notice them for yourself is a really important first step. So what does that look like? Noticing even basic needs for some people, like hunger, thirst, tiredness, exhaustion, this is the place to start, with these very basic human needs. What is it that you need to do throughout your workday? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Do you need a short break? Have you moved your body? Is there pain in your body? It can even come down to things like adjusting your chair or your work environment so it would better support you. So, beginning to re-establish that connection, which is something that, for some of us can also be quite complicated if we do carry a lot of trauma. So I encourage you, if that's something that feels really unsettling, this idea of even tuning in physically to what we need is to seek some support and assistance for that. Another thing we can do, which can be very useful and helpful, is to do self validation journaling. And so, people journal for different reasons and, keep different kinds of journals. This type of journal is really just a brief practice each day of being able to acknowledge some of your wins, some of the things that you're proud about in your workday, for example. Also being able to acknowledge where you've used your strengths. Also, it can begin to help us catch areas where we maybe needed more support during the day or where we did engage in a fawning response. So what are some examples of that? You can ask yourself if you're keeping a self-validation journal, things like, where did I need more support today? Where did I need reassurance? What hurt me today? Where did I feel impacted by my work? Were there any comments or that were made that I found hurtful or impactful? Being able to just write and inventory and notice some of these things can be very helpful because again, this can help us rebuild that relationship to ourselves. So thinking about some of those prompts. And the idea here is, you are beginning to learn to be a supportive, reassuring presence for your own self. And because it takes a lot of interpersonal practice sometimes to begin to um, change our responses in real time, a great place to start is just with the pen and paper, right? Just with the journal, being able to acknowledge, okay, what did I really think? What did I really need? What did I really want to do? Are there any areas where, I felt really impacted by my day? And what did I need in that moment? So beginning to rebuild that relationship. Secondly, we want to begin to experiment with allowing ourselves to exist in the space. So, what does that look like? So, for those of us that really engage in fawning response frequently, just even taking up physical space can be a challenge. So, beginning to think of things like, um, do I raise my hand in a meeting? When I'm asked for my opinion, do I offer it? Do I put it into the space? Um, What's it like for me to ask for things, right? Which is kind of a form of taking up space in the workplace. Ask for time off. Ask for an accommodation. What is it like to begin to put some of my needs out there? And again, this is something that can feel really unsettling if we're not accustomed to do it. So something that you might want to think about is making a list, of some of the ways that you could take up more space at work. And you can rank them from like the most difficult, to maybe the least. Like maybe there's a few things that you'd feel more comfortable doing. Maybe you need a piece of equipment that could better help you do your work. And that feels, less intimidating, to do than perhaps asking for um, professional development or, some other type of benefit. So, just making a bit of a list there as well around, where are the places that I could take up a little bit more space at work? And then, trying out certainly the ones that feel a little bit more doable so that you can kind of begin to work up to, taking up more space. And then the last idea I have for you, if you notice fawning response at work is, to really get to know your nervous system. So this isn't about, blaming and shaming and being wrong, for engaging in this behavior. In fact, survival responses are incredibly adaptive, right? Like, how incredible is it that our nervous systems have found a way to keep us safer and to keep us alive and to minimize threats so that we can continue to survive. So again, incredibly adaptive response. But thinking about the things, because we can think about fawning response as actually being a state of dysregulation, right? It's a signal if we're feeling unsafe and that we need to, again, engage in these behaviors that really diminish our own sense of self. Um, it's a signal that we are emotionally dysregulated. And so, as you get to know your nervous system, and as you begin to notice, oh, I feel like I'm a bit activated here, or I notice I want to engage in kind of this type of pleasing behavior or minimizing self behavior, we can begin to notice what also helps us get into a more balanced state. And so with fawning, um, one of the ways we understand it is it's both a state of hyperarousal and hypoarousal. Hyperarousal is when our nervous system is on high alert. So there's a lot of energy and physical and emotional arousal involved in hyperarousal. So scanning the environment, we're anxious, we're looking for danger, we're ready, right? Um, Hypoarousal is the opposite, right? It's where there is a lack of stimulation, where we begin to numb out, check out, disconnect. We become unresponsive to the environment instead of highly attuned. So in fawning, both of those things are happening at the same time, right? We have the hyperarousal, that high state of alert, scanning the environment, checking in on people's needs, monitoring for conflict, monitoring for disagreement, trying to control and manage the lives, the needs, the opinions of other people. And then we have a detachment as well. We have hypoarousal. So that detachment is happening from the self, right? We are tuning out, numbing out the internal messaging, the internal voice, the internal signaling that's going on inside of us. So again, this signals the fact that we are in a state of dysregulation and some balance is needed. So, beginning to notice the things that help you get back into a state of balance. And there's, just so many options and choices and practices that can help with emotional regulation. No two nervous systems are designed exactly the same way, so they won't necessarily respond to the same types of interventions. But I really encourage you to play around and to look around and see what you find useful and helpful. For some people, when they're emotionally dysregulated, they need to move energy. They need to run, lift weights, exercise, walk, they need to be in nature. That's something that can be really regulating. Some of us need to co-regulate. We find nervous system balance by connecting to trusted, safe other people, right? Maybe we tell our best friend or our partner or a family member around, what's going on, and this helps to kind of settle or calm us. Some of us might need to evolve sensory grounding, right? Some people enjoy things like pressure, weighted blankets, self massage. There's again a host of different tools and strategies. Some people need to write down what it is that they're experiencing by engaging the cognitive mind. This helps, make sense of what's happening and diminish, some of the distress in our nervous system. So we're all very different. Get to know yourself and what works for you and what helps you feel like you can be in touch, with yourself, but not also overwhelmed, right? That's that hyper arousal state that we want to be mindful of as well. So I hope those ideas are helpful to you. If you would like to learn more about fawning response and how it shows up in your specific experience, feel free to connect with me. Always lovely to hear from listeners, to hear what your further questions might be, and to hear what landed from the episode for you. So if you found this useful and helpful, I'd also invite you to, follow Healthy at Work, to share this episode with someone who needs it, and to like and subscribe to this channel as well. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you back here next time. Thanks for listening today. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not medical advice or mental health treatment. If you're struggling at work, please reach out to the supports within your workplace or community. This podcast was gratefully recorded on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations.